Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sisatris, and a while ago I did a video on sci-fi subgenres, and so this time I wanted to do a video on fantasy subgenres. So let's get into it. Now, there's a ton of fantasy subgenres. I won't get through all of them. These are sort of the most common ones that I encounter, but there are others for sure. When I did the sci-fi video, for some reason I blanked and completely forgot to mention any of like the punks, so like cyberpunk, steampunk, solar punk, all that kind of stuff. And so I'm sure there's going to be subgenres and genres that I'm going to miss, but these are kind of the big ones. These are the ones that I read the most often, and these are the ones that I sort of like the most and have examples of in my library. So, moving on. First off, we're going to start with the big one, and that is epic fantasy. Epic fantasy is sometimes also called high fantasy, but high fantasy is more like an umbrella term that includes a couple different subgenres. Epic fantasy is usually, it has tons of characters, usually multiple POVs, the stakes are huge, you know, fate of the world kind of stuff. You've got sort of a big enemy. It's not usually just, you know, the enemy is sort of, you know, political scheming of like one person. It can, but for the most part, the stakes are always huge, and the, you know, there's always sort of the Dark Lord or the sort of great evil, or there's something affecting kind of the whole world, and it's usually a very big story. So, perfect example of this, Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is sort of the beginning. This is sort of the fantasy, that sort of elevated fantasy from sort of a children's genre into something that appealed to adults. There were fantasy stuff before Tolkien, but it was, again, it was often aimed at younger readers, or if it was something like, you know, Arthurian fantasy kind of stuff, it was more in that kind of realm. So this is sort of what kicked off sort of fantasy as like a mainstream genre that appealed to a lot of people. But even then, Lord of the Rings wasn't really mainstream for a while. It was popular and it was very influential in fantasy circles, but it didn't really, like, you know, the boom we have today where fantasy is sort of read by everybody is a fairly new thing. And this isn't something, you know, in like the 70s or the 80s, if you talk to someone about Lord of the Rings, you know, they would be like, oh, that's just a thing for nerds, you know, sort of thing. This is where you get things like Daevebad and Stormlight Archive and Wheel of Time, all these big, huge series with massive books that have, you know, huge sweeping stories. So that's epic fantasy. Now we're going to move into something a little more lower key, and this would be something, you know, in terms of high fantasy, this would be sort of low fantasy, but there's not really a distinction in terms of quality. Low fantasy doesn't mean that it's less than high fantasy. High fantasy is more like it's based in a secondary world, and it's sort of built from the ground up, and there's a lot of detail. Lower fantasy is either based in sort of our world, or it is in a fantasy world, but it's not really concerned with sort of the specifics about like the magic system or the cultures or anything. It's more focused on like characters and just, you know, kind of their own journeys, but we'll get into that more. But the next genre I wanted to talk about is urban fantasy, and this is where you see a lot of the long series that are set in our world. I'm thinking of things like the Dresden Files or Mercy Thompson. It's usually very noir kind of influence, where you've got kind of a lone character moving through sort of our world, and you've got sort of the fantasy world is sort of in the shadows, where you've got the main character who sometimes has magic, who can move between those kind of worlds. And I'm not talking about actual portal fantasy where you travel to another place, but I'm talking about worlds in terms of like the underground. It also ties into things like crime fiction, where you've got sort of someone trying to solve a mystery, and usually the perpetrator of the mystery is either associated with sort of the magical underground or something thereof. The example that I chose for this one is Anansi Boys by Neil Gaiman. American Gods does also kind of count as urban fantasy, but it is bigger in scope. This one I chose because it's more focused on just kind of the everyday stuff. It's sort of absurdist, it's funny, it's based on sort of the question of like, what happens if you woke up one day and discovered that you were the son of a deity, and how would that affect your normal life when all you want to do is just do normal things? So urban fantasy doesn't always have to involve kind of detective kind of archetype going around solving mysteries. It could also just be something where you've got the real world, and then you've got this magical world, and the magical world is sort of threatening to overturn the stability and calm of the real world. And so that's where you've got things like this. All right, the next subgenre is fairly new, but it has existed before in sort of other forms, and that is romantasy. This is sort of a portmanteau that showed up fairly recently. No one can really agree on specifically what romantasy is, but I'm going to give it a go. In the past, romantasy was sort of, you would see it in two different genres. There was like paranormal romance. If you think of things like, you know, Twilight, where you've got sort of, it's kind of taking cues from urban fantasy, where you've got the real world, and then you've got the magical world, and you've got the main character who sort of stumbles on someone she finds interesting, and that person is usually involved in the magical world. And so she becomes kind of a bridge between the magical world and the mundane world, and there's always a romance at the heart of it. With the other genre that you saw was sort of called just fantasy romance. And so both of those together are called romantasy nowadays. I don't know if they would necessarily call Twilight romantasy, but it's sort of that type of story where you've got a love story at the heart of it. It usually follows the conventions of a romance novel. So at the end, either if it's at the end of the series, or the end of a book if it's a standalone, there is always going to be sort of a happily ever after. The two people in the relationship sort of end up together forever. It doesn't end tragically or sad. There's always sort of things in the world that can keep them apart. Sometimes romantasy can have the trappings of sort of epic fantasy, but it's always in service of the love story at the heart of it. So you might have like political machinations, you might have a big dark lord or something in the background, you've got lots of stuff happening, but it's all in service of acting as obstacles for the main character. If you think about, you know, Twilight as an example, you know, there is no like happily ever after until you get to kind of the very end. Everything is sort of up in the air and you're not sure. But a good example of this, one that I read recently, is The Unknown Sun by Cheryl S. Mackey. This is an indie YA kind of romantasy, and it's a lot of fun. I usually read YA stuff when I need sort of a break, when I want something just fun and enjoyable that is just sort of a romp that you just kind of play in. And this is a great one. This is part of a series. The second book is coming out soon. But again, you've got sort of all this big stuff happening. It's like a big fantasy world. There's a fantasy mystery at the heart of it. There's lots of different characters, but the heart of it is sort of the main character and her love interest. And it's sort of a, you know, are they going to end up together? Are they going to be able to stay together? You know, what's going on with that? And that's sort of the heart of it. So romantasy is fairly new, and there's a lot of articles about it, and a lot of people can't really decide. The big thing that shows up every now and then on social media is sort of, does it have to have a happy ending? I would say yes. I think most people agree that it has to have a happy ending. If you have a series like Daevebad, for example, there is a love story in the first book, and there is kind of a love story in the other books, but they're sort of more complicated. But it's not a traditional sort of, it ends with a happily ever after sort of thing, because, you know, the book ends with sort of a cliffhanger, and then the second book ends in a cliffhanger, and so it's very up in the air, and the relationship is a big part of it, but it's not the main focus. The main focus is not getting the two characters together. It's sort of seeing the main character navigating different relationships over time and how that affects her growth and her strength amid kind of a bigger fantasy series. So this I would call epic fantasy. It does have romantic elements, but I would say more that it has like a love story. But, and I don't want to give away spoilers, but it doesn't follow conventional sort of romance novel tropes. A romantasy story, even if it's sort of a longer series and it takes longer for them to get together, it does always have to end with sort of a happily ever after. The focus is on the relationship between the two main characters. Next up, we have another kind of new genre that we're seeing more of lately, and that is cozy fantasy. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about this one. A lot of people think cozy fantasy always has to be romance, and it doesn't. I think the one that got the most attention at the beginning of kind of the trend was Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, and that one is sort of a love story, and it does sort of follow more like romance tropes, so you could maybe call that one romantasy. But cozy fantasy is just, it's usually in a secondary world, and it's focused on low stakes things. It's, you know, small town romance kind of setting, but again, it doesn't have to follow a romance. A great example of this that I read recently is Alex Harrow's The Once and Future Witches. This does have kind of a big story. It also has sort of elements of urban fantasy as well, where you've got sort of characters who are witches who are trying to kind of keep their powers safe from kind of the world around them. But the stakes are mostly just the security of this family. There's no big threat that's gonna threaten kind of the whole world. There is sort of an antagonist who sort of maybe threatens the town, but mostly just threatens the sisters. There's 3 sisters kind of at the heart of this, and the focus is on sort of them interacting with others in sort of a small town setting. Cozy fantasy is sort of like the beginning of Lord of the Rings when you have the Shire section. So you've got, you know, Bilbo's birthday party and the hobbits, and, you know, Gandalf's just sort of there as sort of, he's fun and he's setting off fireworks, and it's, you know, the whole stakes are just, you know, is Bilbo going crazy, and how are we going to pull off this birthday while he's acting sort of strange? And that eventually does tie into a much bigger epic story with huge stakes. But if you have a story that's sort of based in that setting, where it's like the stakes are, you know, one person's mental state or one family's sort of security among uncertain times, or it could be, you know, one person starting a business like in Legends and Lattes, or, you know, something like that. So cozy fantasy is always focused on family and friends and personal growth. It doesn't have to be a love story. This one does have kind of a love story in it for one of the characters, but it's a side, like it's a subplot. It's not the main focus. So cozy fantasy is very much sort of, you want to live in a fantasy world and you want to have maybe some peril, but not like, there's no like questing or adventuring. Usually things maybe take place all in the same place. Next up is a fun one, and that is historical fantasy. And this is where you see a lot of sort of Arthurian legends and stuff, books set in that. It's sort of, it's set in kind of a real historical period in our world. But it's sort of at a time when sort of magic and folklore and maybe even the gods interact with people. And so it's kind of meant to show like a bygone age when magic was still a part of the world before it sort of faded. And a great example of this is Sistersong by Lucy Holland. This is sort of based in sort of ancient Britain. It has ties to sort of Arthurian legend, sort of. It also ties into the Christianization of Britain and sort of the effects that that had on people. But wrapped up in all of that, there is magic at the heart of it. You do have a character who, I won't spoil who that is because it's very cool, but you do have a character who can work magic, who, you know, becomes involved in sort of 3 sisters and is part of kind of their journey as to kind of what's happening. And it's sort of, you know, there's magic in conflict with sort of the new religious beliefs that outlaw magic. And so it's set in like our world. It's not a secondary fantasy world. And so a lot of times it does have sort of similarities to maybe epic fantasy, maybe even cozy fantasy, high fantasy for sure, but it's set in kind of a grounded, real place, based on sort of folk legends and folk beliefs that really did exist. And this one is based off of sort of a ballad, like a murder ballad, about sisters and a complicated love affair and the awful results of that whole thing. I don't want to give away too many spoilers because this is one of my favorite books ever. I love it so much. But historical fantasy is definitely where you get sort of like, you know, ancient Earth, but, you know, people are still facing, you know, magic and, you know, demons and monsters and things in our world. Now, I debated whether or not to include this next one, because I wasn't really sure if it fit, but I'll do it anyways. And that is magical realism. I've done a video about magical realism before, and it's more a subset of literary fiction than it is a subset of fantasy, but it does contain fantastical elements, and so I figured I'd mention it anyways. Magical realism is sort of, again, it's set in the real world, usually in the past, and so it kind of has ties with historical fantasy, which is why I wanted to kind of include it after this. But the focus is more on sort of the real journeys of the characters, and the magic elements are sort of secondary. It's more like the characters are living in sort of a mood ring version of the world where their wishes and their emotions and their thoughts can sort of manifest things in the world, but it's not codified the way it is in magic or in fantasy. So if someone does something magical, there's no explanation of sort of how they did it, why they did it. It's just sort of things that happen. The world sort of reacts to them. This is where you also get you get kind of a sense of like folklore and folktales. If you read, you know, indigenous folktales where you've got random things that can happen, you know, a person can turn like a reed into a weapon, or if they think hard enough, they can cause the storm to come, that reflects their emotional state. And that's where you see that in magical realism, where it's like people can cause things to happen and fantastical things happen, but it's just a part of the world and no one really comments on it. It's more like, wow, she must be really sad because, you know, it's rained for 10 days, and every time it thunders, it sounds like her weeping, you know, that kind of thing. But it's not fantasy, really. A good example of this is Like Water for Chocolate. I've talked about this book many times. I love it so much. And in this one, for example, you know, it's all based on cooking and kind of the drama of kind of a family and all their kind of trials and tribulations. But like at one point, she's making a cake that involves rose petals, and she accidentally stabs her finger on one of the thorns on the rose, and a drop of blood falls in the recipe, and she doesn't notice it, but she keeps making it anyways. And when she serves the cake to someone, they are suddenly overcome with like passion and desire, and they fly off and they marry the first man that they met and run off, and the spot where they kiss forever smells like rose petals, kind of thing. And so it's not like she did a spell or she chose to do this. It's just, this is the world. Their thoughts and beliefs and emotions sort of influence the world, and they just sort of live in it. So it's kind of a heightened reality, slightly surreal, but it's just got this kind of magical gloss to it that is just very cool. And it's really difficult to pull that off. There's other authors who have kind of tried. Another example of magical realism is the book called A Winter's Tale by Mark Helprin. And I read that one, and it feels a little more fantasy than magical realism, because it's set in kind of an alternate New York that's surrounded by this sort of mist layer, and there's trains that run through the air all throughout the city, and it's sort of fantastical and magical, and it does have that kind of no one comments on the magic and things just kind of happen, but it goes a little too far and makes things a little too magical. So instead of being rooted in the real world with a sort of magical gloss over it, it just feels like it's an alternate version of our world that is magical. So it's really hard to pull off, but when it works really well. All right, next up is a genre that I haven't read a lot of, but I do want to read more of. I think the genre in general gets a bad rap, and that is grimdark. Grimdark is kind of a subset of sort of epic fantasy, but it's set in a world that is sort of almost beyond hope, or like almost beyond repair. It's a very violent world. It's a world where sort of injustice and unfairness is kind of the law of the land. And so you've often got characters fighting against sort of a world in which nothing is really going to come help them. There is no sort of order to the world. It's not like epic fantasy where you can sort of defeat the Dark Lord and everything sort of returns to normal. You know, things can be fixed. In grimdark, it's more often the world is a very cruel, unforgiving place, and everyone is just trying to survive. And so you see a lot more anti-heroes or gray morality characters than you see in epic fantasy. You don't often see sort of valiant, heroic heroes that are sort of all good. It's everyone is sort of hurt and damaged by the world. And so it's very brutal, and it can often sometimes be quite graphic. It's usually quite violent. Grimdark is a really great genre because it sort of allows authors to take the injustices of sort of the real world, you know, the injustices and the prejudices and the sort of social failings of our world, magnify it by 10 and put it in a fantasy world as a way to sort of comment on it. Everyone always talks about grimdark as sort of a joke genre that's sort of only loved by sort of edgelords and like teenagers who are just insecure kind of thing. And that's not the case. Grimdark is a great genre. Joe Abercrombie is sort of a master in the field. I've not read any of his work, but he is on my list. Mike Shackle's another one. I have his book, We Are the Dead, in my wish list. And so you know, if I ever find that one, I do want to read that one. But the example that I chose, and this might not be exactly grimdark, but it's kind of the closest, and it is something I've read, and that is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is a fantasy world based on sort of pre-Columbian South America. And there aren't really any sort of valiant, virtuous heroes. It's sort of a brutal world. It's a very unfair world. The first scene is like pretty cringe-inducing in the best way, because you've got a character who's like getting their eyes sewn shut for sort of a religious ritual. And it's just like, okay, this is the kind of book we're in. All right, good. But it's great. I do need to read the second book because the third book is coming out very soon. And it's such a unique magical environment. It's a fantasy landscape that you don't normally see. And it just works so well. But again, there's not really any sort of heroes to root for. It's more just everyone is trying to survive. And there's chaos happening and everything is sort of against them, and there's characters who make bad decisions, and you just kind of hope to see who kind of comes out of it in the end. So this is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful series. I think the series is called Between Earth and Sky. Rebecca Roanhorse is amazing. I actually first encountered her stuff in Star Wars novels. She's written some Star Wars novels, and she's fantastic. And I loved this book, and I definitely want to continue with the series. Next up, we've got kind of a hybrid genre, and that is science fantasy. And this is kind of a blend of sci-fi and fantasy in kind of a unique way. There's like technology, but there's also magic. Sometimes you've got magical devices that act like technological devices do in sci-fi, but they're powered by magic. And so you can have things like flying airships alongside dragons, and you can have, you know, complex scientific explorations into how things work, but there's also sort of magic at the heart of it. And a good example of this is N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth Trilogy. This is the third book, The Stone Sky. I was going to give the first one the 5th season, but I've lent that to someone, and so this is the one that I'll use. But in this one, you've got sort of technology and you've got magic at the same time. It blends so well. It's really hard to say kind of what specific genre this book or this trilogy is, because, you know, you've got these flying obelisks that move about the planet, and you've got sort of, you know, there's at one point they find sort of the place where the obelisks are created, and it's technologically based, but the obelisks sort of function in a fantasy way. And then you've also got sort of other beings who can manipulate elements, and you've got people with magical abilities, and so it's this great mishmash of kind of everything, and it's just so cool. These books will break your brain because they're sometimes difficult to understand what's going on until you get kind of into it, but the world building is just fantastic and it's so cool, and I definitely want to see more of this kind of blending of science and fantasy. The biggest example of this that everyone would probably know of is Star Wars. You've got sort of the Force, which is, you know, bestows mystical abilities on people, but then you've also got spaceships and technology and robots and everything, and so it's kind of a blend of both of those things. So science fantasy is great, and I want to read more of it. Now, the next genre, I guess, would probably also fit within historical fantasy, but it's kind of its own thing, and so I figured I would just talk about it as a separate genre, and that is myth retellings. I've talked about them many times on this channel. I love them a lot. Myth retellings is where you take a specific myth or legend from a certain culture, and you either focus on the main character or focus on a side character, and you sort of tell that story in novel form. So you're usually working from like poetry sources or fragments, and you sort of arrange it into something. And so it has a lot of elements of epic fantasy, it has a lot of elements of historical fantasy. It's just a very unique kind of mishmash where you've got gods and monsters and magic alongside regular people set in kind of historical ancient Earth. Great example of this is Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. I loved this book. It takes a sort of minor character from the story of sort of, you know, Theseus and the Minotaur, and tells her story, and she's a complicated character. She's not really a heroic character. She's not a perfect character. She's very flawed, and it's just sort of her trying to survive. So in a way, this also kind of has some ties to sort of, you know, grimdark, but I wouldn't call this grimdark at all. But it's just, you've got sort of this epic scope, and it's more like, you know, what if you could kind of live in that world? You know, myth retellings are sometimes hit or miss. Sometimes I don't always connect with the way that an author interprets the source. But when it works well, it's just so gripping, because these are characters that usually people know, and when you're able to take a character that everyone sort of knows or knows about and make you care deeply about them, then it's just perfect. I love it so much. And finally, number 10 on this list is Sword and Sorcery. This is, again, it's like a subset of a subset. So it has a lot of ties to high fantasy, epic fantasy. It could also connect to historical fantasy sometimes, but it's Sword and Sorcery is a lot like epic fantasy, except the focus is on sort of one hero character who's sort of going around having adventures. If you think of like Conan the Barbarian, that's a good example. It's not about sort of, you know, all the different characters and the world and, you know, facing off some kind of great evil. It's more sort of one character that we follow who sort of has various adventures and solves problems and then moves on to the next adventure. And so you've got sort of not lower stakes, but the stakes are always, how is this person going to defeat this obstacle? It has a lot of similarities to sort of superhero stories where you've got sort of, it's one character's journey to grow and change over time as they sort of increasingly face bigger and bigger obstacles. And I don't know if this is a perfect example of it, because I know things do get bigger in scope in later books, but The Last Wish, the first book in the Witcher series, is kind of a good example of this, because you've got Geralt of Rivia as our protagonist character, and it follows him sort of overcoming various obstacles and having different adventures and stuff. If you're focusing on like the video game, especially Witcher 3, again, that's very sword and sorcery, because we're following just him. You know, there are other side characters, but it's not like there's multiple POV characters, and we're looking at how everyone's reacting to kind of all this. Now, I know things change in later books, because it does get kind of bigger in scope, and it has more characters, and it gets more complicated. But, you know, if you're looking for kind of an example of sort of sword and sorcery, I don't have any of the Conan books with me, but they all kind of follow the, you know, like Tarzan of the Apes kind of thing, or like the planetary romance you find in sci-fi, where you've got sort of a hero character facing obstacles, and then he rides off into the sunset and has more adventures and that kind of thing. So sword and sorcery is a ton of fun, and I think it needs to make a comeback, because it's just a fun genre. It's very old-fashioned, and I really like that. So those are my 10 subgenres of fantasy. I know there's others, and there's lots of granular kind of differences between them, and there's some books in here that fit into different categories simultaneously, so it's, you know, not a neat and tidy kind of thing, but that's sort of the main list. We'll kind of go from there. But if you have any others that you want to talk about, definitely mention them in the comments. I love having discussions with all of you, because that's kind of the whole reason why I do this. I just like blabbing about things that I love, but when I can connect with folks who also love them, it's like, yes, there's other people who share my interests. I'm not just a loser, but maybe I am a loser, I don't know. Anyways, with that said, I'll let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.